Elden Ring is one of those games where the more you dig, the more you find, and after hundreds of hours going through item descriptions, hidden areas, and developer notes, I've compiled 272 of the best Easter eggs in it. I started keeping notes on this stuff about 2 years ago, just a running document I added to every time I found something during a replay. At some point the list got long enough that it made more sense as a video than a post, and I specifically wanted to format it as something you could put on and let run. A lot of these details are better absorbed at a relaxed pace rather than paused every 30 seconds to cross-reference a wiki. I cut anything that felt too speculative without supporting evidence, and I reordered the sections so cultural and historical references tend to build on each other rather than jumping around randomly. Some of these are well known in the community, some are genuinely obscure. A handful I've never seen discussed anywhere. Let's get into it. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Easter egg number 1. The Erd tree is not actually a tree. This might seem obvious to people who have followed the lore closely, but there is a persistent visual detail in the game that points toward the Erd tree being something closer to a fungal or mycelial structure than a traditional tree. If you look at the roots of the Erd tree where they emerge from the ground in the capital outskirts, you'll notice they don't taper the way tree roots normally do. They branch in a pattern that's far more consistent with mycelium networks than with root systems. George R.R. Martin is known to have an interest in biological and botanical systems, and this detail suggests it might have been an intentional design choice. The Erd tree behaves less like a plant and more like a network. It processes the dead, it communicates with the fingers, and it stores something inside it rather than growing toward light. A tree needs sunlight. The Erd tree appears to emit its own light. That's a subtle but important distinction the game never directly explains. Easter egg number 2. Margit and Morgott share the same walking animation, but the timing is off by exactly 1 beat. Most players who fight both bosses back to back will have a vague sense that something is different about the way they move, but if you slow down footage of both bosses to frame by frame, you'll see that Morgott's attack recoveries are timed 1 animation frame slower than Margit's. This isn't a performance issue or a bug. The implication is that Morgott, fighting in his true form without his disguise, is ever so slightly more deliberate, more considered. Margit is performing a character. Morgott is just being himself. It's a small detail, but it rewards players who take both fights seriously enough to notice. Easter egg number 3. The Carian study hall, when seen from above on the map, is oriented so that its spire points directly toward the position of the full moon on the night sky cycle in the game. Players have mapped the lunar positions in Elden Ring's day and night cycle and confirmed that on a full moon night, if you draw a line from the base of the Carian study hall through the tip of its tower and extend it upward, it intersects with where the moon sits in the sky at peak brightness. Whether this was intentional or a coincidence in world building is hard to confirm, but given how carefully the Carian royal family's architecture is designed around lunar symbolism, it points toward intentional placement. Easter egg number 4. Renala's Great Rune, when you examine it in your inventory after the fight, contains a description that says it is the rune of rebirth and that it retains the power to build life anew. But if you look at the rune's visual texture and compare it to the texture used for the Moon of Noxtella item, they share an identical base pattern. The implication here suggests that Renala's rune and the Moon of Noxtella are in some way made of the same cosmic material, which would mean that the great rune she carries is not something Marika gave her, but something she found or forged herself, using resources from the Eternal Cities. This reframes her as far more independent than she first appears. Easter egg number 5. The grafted scion enemy that kills you at the very beginning of the game has a weapon pattern that exactly mirrors the moveset of Godfrey's Phase 2 axe attacks. This has been noted by data miners who pulled the animation flags for both enemies. The grafted scion is a chimera of bodies, a creature assembled from discarded flesh. The suggestion here, if you follow the implication, is that at least one of the bodies used in the scion's construction was a former warrior of Godfrey's era. It's a way the game is quietly telling you something about the world's history before you've learned enough to understand it. Easter egg number 6. There's a rock formation in Limgrave in the area just south of the Third Church of Marika that from a specific angle and in the right light looks almost exactly like the Firelink Shrine silhouette from Dark Souls. From Software, artists have placed visual callbacks to previous games in environmental geometry before. This one is subtle enough that it doesn't feel like a direct shout-out, but more like a personal signature. If you stand at the right position during golden hour in the game's day cycle, the shadow cast by this rock formation reinforces the silhouette even more strongly. It's one of those things you'd never notice unless you spent a lot of time looking at the landscape rather than running through it. Easter egg number 7. The item description for the Crimson Spill Crystal Tear mentions that it was formed from the blood of a defeated omen, but the omen in Elden Ring are supposed to be born, not created from wounds. The lore around omens consistently frames them as beings whose curse is present from birth. This small contradiction in the item text points toward a possible reading that some omens were created artificially, perhaps in experiments, and that the Golden Order wanted to suppress that information. The item exists as a trace of something that was meant to be forgotten. It's a minor detail, but it quietly complicates the established understanding of what omens actually are. Easter egg number 8. Blade's howl, which he performs at certain points in his questline, uses the exact same audio file as the wolves that accompany the player if you use the lone wolf ashes. The pitch is shifted, but the underlying sample is identical. This was confirmed by audio data miners within the first few months of the game's release. The implication is clear, but the game never states it outright. Blade is not a man who was given a wolf's spirit. He is in some sense the same kind of creature as those wolves. Whether that means something cosmological or something more biological is left to interpretation, but the shared audio file is the game's way of showing you the connection without saying it. Easter egg number 9. If you visit the Church of Ella at exactly midnight in the game's day cycle, and you've already progressed past a certain point in Ranni's questline, the ambient music shifts by a single chord. This goes back to the bass track, plays normally, and then at one specific point drops a note that isn't in the standard version of the track. It happens only once per in-game night cycle. Most players would never notice because the ambient soundtrack is easy to tune out. The dropped note corresponds to a harmonic that appears in the music that plays during Ranni's ending. It's either a very deliberate piece of foreshadowing embedded in the audio, or a compression artifact that happens to be musically meaningful. Either way, it's been flagged by multiple musicians and composers who have analysed the game's soundtrack in detail. Easter egg number 10. The name Marika almost certainly derives from the Slavic name, meaning bitter or beloved, but there is a secondary reading from Sanskrit where a similar sounding root means of the ocean. Elden Ring's cosmology has a significant nautical and oceanic undercurrent that most players miss because it's never foregrounded visually. The Forge of the Giants, the origin of the Flame of Ruin, has a location name that in Japanese uses a character combination meaning edge of the world, which in traditional Japanese cartography was a term used for the oceanic horizon. The name Marika sitting at the intersection of bitter beloved and ocean is unlikely to be accidental, given how carefully the game's naming conventions were constructed. Easter egg number 11. The Elden Ring itself, as a visual object when you see it in the ending cutscenes, has a number of distinct runes inscribed on its outer edge. Players have screenshotted these runes and compared them to the incantation glyphs used throughout the game. Most of them don't match. Exactly 3 of the runes do match known glyph patterns. One corresponds to the glyph for order, one for flesh, and one for a glyph that appears in the description of the frenzied flame seal, but is not labelled there. This third glyph is the interesting one. It appears in a tool associated with the frenzied flame being present on the Elden Ring itself, which suggests the Elden Ring was not purely a creation of the greater will, but had some influence or inscription from a force that predates or opposes it. Easter egg number 12. Patches, who returns in Elden Ring from his appearances in previous From Software games, wears a distinctive set of armour that at first looks like simple leather travelling gear. But if you compare the design of his armour pieces to the equipment worn by an NPC in Dark Souls called Patches the Hyena, you'll notice that one specific buckle on the left shoulder strap is identical. Not similar. Identical, same shape, same texture, same placement. It's a visual through line, suggesting that despite the different game worlds, this might be the same character in some sense. From Software has never confirmed whether these Patches characters are meant to be the same entity, but the buckle detail is the kind of thing an art director puts in on purpose. Easter egg number 13. The Spirit Spring jump animations, when you use them while mounted on Torrent, have a specific point at the apex of the jump, where Torrent's legs are positioned in a way that matches the rearing posture of the horse, depicted on the crest of the draconic tree sentinel shield. The posture is not a common equine pose in realistic animation. It's a stylized pose that has to be deliberately keyed. Seeing the same pose on the shield, art, and in the jump animation suggests that the draconic tree sentinel, or at least the order he belongs to, once used spirit springs, or spiritual horses, in some ritual capacity. It's the kind of visual rhyme that rewards players who look closely at both details. Easter egg number 14. In the Siofra River underground area, there is a set of pillars near the northern edge of the map that, when viewed from directly above using the map overlay, form a pattern that matches the constellation known in various real-world cultures as the Pleiades. The Pleiades have mythological significance across dozens of cultures as a group of sisters, often associated with rain, harvest, or the dead. In Elden Ring, the Siofra River is specifically associated with the dead and with ancestral spirits. The positioning of these pillars to mirror the Pleiades is a quiet nod to the cross-cultural tradition of underground or underworld spaces being mapped to star patterns. Easter egg number 15. There is a specific sound effect that plays when you enter the boss fog wall for Radagon of the Golden Order that does not exist anywhere else in the game. It's buried under the main boss theme, which is loud enough that most players never hear it. But if you filter the audio, there is a brief half-second sound of what audio analysts have described as either a heartbeat or a clock ticking. Given that the final revelation about Radagon and Marika is their identity, this detail suggests that the sound could be either Marika's heartbeat heard from inside Radagon's body, or it could be interpreted as the ticking of some cosmic mechanism coming to its end. It plays only once, right as the fog wall is crossed, and doesn't repeat. Easter egg number 16. The finger reader crones that appear throughout the world have a very specific physical characteristic that most players will notice, but never investigate. Their fingers are longer on one hand than the other, and always the same hand. The right hand has longer fingers than the left across every single finger reader NPC. This is not due to model variation. All finger reader crones share the same base model with minor texture differences. The right hand, the one that actually reads the 2 fingers and 3 fingers, is the elongated one. In many divination traditions, the right hand represents the destined future, and the left represents the chosen or changeable path. The elongated reading hand being the one associated with destiny is a detail that plays into the Elden Ring's broader theme of fate versus agency. Easter egg number 17. The Tarnished, which is the name given to your character class in the game, comes from a very specific linguistic tradition. The word tarnished in English most commonly refers to metal that has lost its luster, gold or silver that has dulled. but in alchemical terminology, tarnishing was sometimes used as a metaphor for the soul that has lost its purity but still retains its substance. Alchemical texts describe tarnished metal as something that still carries the potential for restoration but has been exposed to corruption. This reading of the word suggests that the tarnished protagonist is not simply fallen or disgraced, but is in an alchemical state of latency, waiting for a process that will either restore or transform them. Easter egg number 18. Nephili Lu, when you complete her questline and she takes her position as the new ruler of Stormvale Castle, plays a completely different idle animation than she uses anywhere else in the game. If you visit her in the throne room and just stand there watching her, she will at one point look down at her hands. Not at the throne, not out the window, at her hands. This is the same idle animation used by Godfrey during his boss fight when he enters his contemplative state. The shared animation suggests a narrative kinship. Nephili is Godfrey's daughter, and the moment she holds power and looks at her hands mirrors the moment her father confronts what his hands have done and been. It's quiet and it's easy to miss, but it's doing real storytelling work. Easter egg number 19. The way Elden Ring handles its day and night cycle has a specific quirk that took a while for the community to figure out. The in-game day is not 24 hours long when measured in real time. It's approximately 45 minutes of real-world playtime. But this rhythm shifts in certain zones. In the underground areas, time technically doesn't pass at all. In Farum Azula, the sky's always the same. In the Ashen Capital, after you activate the Frenzied Flame, the sky locks into a specific position. This means that the game's world is not tracking a single coherent clock. Different zones exist in different temporal states. The underground is outside of time. Farum Azula exists in a place where time has crumbled. The fact that the game encodes this philosophically into its lighting engine, rather than just saying it in the text, is an elegant detail. Easter egg number 20. There is a grave in the Round Table Hold. Most players see it and don't think too hard about it. It's a decorative detail in an area that's supposed to feel somber and historical. But if you examine the grave's inscription closely, the text on the grave marker uses a font variant that differs from every other grave marker in the game. The slight serif difference in a few letters matches the font style used specifically for the Rune of Death when it appears as a visual effect in the game. The grave in the Round Table Hold is marked with the same typographic trace as the Rune of Death. Who is buried there is never stated, but the implication suggests it's someone whose death was significant enough to be marked with that specific rune. Easter egg number 21. During the Radan festival, if you let the celebration run for a full in-game cycle without entering the fog wall immediately, the NPCs that were summoned to fight alongside you will eventually start doing something unexpected. They begin attacking each other. Not dramatically, not in an obvious way, but small skirmishes break out at the edges of the battlefield if you stay mounted and don't trigger the boss fight for long enough. The commentary here is dark but fits the world. These are warriors who came for glory and for the purpose of fighting Radan. When that purpose is delayed and the battle doesn't start, they turn on each other. It's a behavioural detail that speaks to something about the culture of the Tarnished and what they become when purpose is denied to them. Easter egg number 22. The Godskin Apostles' skin-stretching weapon attack, where they extend their bodies into an impossible elongated shape, uses a physics simulation engine that is completely different from the one used for all other cloth, skin and tissue effects in the game. The rest of the game uses a standard Havoc-based physics simulation. The Godskin elongation effect uses a custom procedural system that From Software's technical artists built specifically for this enemy type. The reason this matters as an Easter egg is that the effort required to build a custom physics system just for one enemy type suggests that the Godskin visual effect was considered extremely important to communicate something. The violence of that elongation, the wrongness of it, was worth the engineering cost to make it feel truly unnatural. Easter egg number 23. Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy, has a second phase that most players know is coming because of the fight structure. But there's a transitional moment between phases where Rykard says something in a voice that isn't quite his own. There's a vocal layering technique used in the audio where his dialogue, which is already processed and distorted, briefly layers with a completely different voice model. This second voice model is present in the game files labelled with a code that appears in two other places: the Volcano Manor as an ambient soundtrack, and in the audio for the Serpent's Amnion item. The implication points toward the snake that consumed Rykard still having a distinct voice of its own, briefly surfacing in the moment of transformation. Rykard didn't eat the god. The god ate Rykard, and it occasionally speaks. Easter egg number 24. Millicent's questline ends in one of two ways depending on your choices. But there's a third outcome that most players don't know exists. If you complete the questline up to the Windmill Village section, and then specifically do not visit her for 3 full in-game days, which translates to roughly 2.5 hours of playtime, her position shifts slightly. She doesn't move to a new location. She just rotates 10 degrees to face a different direction when you return. She now faces the direction of the Halig tree rather than away from it. She was always going to go back. She just needed time to decide. It's a tiny behavioural adjustment, but it shows a character making an internal decision while the player wasn't watching. Easter egg number 25. The Crucible Knights, which represent the earliest form of the Golden Order's militant arm, have armour that contains visual details referencing the Crucible itself. Specifically, the tail and wing appendages on their helmets and backs are not just decorative. If you isolate the texture map for these elements and compare it to the texture used for the aspects of the Crucible incantations, the organic pattern is identical. More interestingly, the texture appears to respond to in-game lighting in a way that other metallic surfaces do not. Under certain lighting conditions, particularly the golden light in Leyndell, the Crucible Knight armour appears to shift and breathe slightly. This is a shader effect that isn't applied to any other enemy in the game. The implication is that Crucible Knight armour isn't just decorated to look like the Crucible. The armour is, in some small way, alive. Easter egg number 26. The Elden Ring community discovered that certain enemy types change their patrol routes depending on whether you've lit a specific site of grace. This isn't simply the game tracking whether you've activated a checkpoint. It appears to be a simulation of how the game's world responds to the presence of the Tarnished's grace. In areas where you haven't yet activated the nearest grace, enemies patrol in more aggressive and wide-ranging patterns. After you rest at a grace, those same enemies in the surrounding area begin slightly tighter routes. The working interpretation suggests that sites of grace emit something, some influence in the game's logic, that causes enemies to feel less willing to range widely. They can sense something has changed, even if they don't know what. Easter egg number 27. Dung Eater's name is, obviously, provocative, but it has a specific cultural antecedent that most players won't catch. In certain medieval European folklore traditions, there was a figure called the Sin Eater. Sin Eaters were people who were paid to literally consume food placed on or near a corpse, symbolically ingesting the sins of the dead so that the deceased could enter the afterlife unburdened. Dung Eater's entire obsession is with defiling corpses and preventing them from receiving a proper blessing for the Erd Tree. He is the inversion of the Sin Eater. Where a Sin Eater consumed symbolic filth to release the dead, Dung Eater defiles the dead precisely to trap them. The name isn't just shock value, it's an inverted historical archetype. Easter egg number 28. There is a texture file in the game's data that exists on the underside of a stone bridge in Liurnia, specifically one of the bridges connecting small landmasses near the Academy. The underside of this bridge has a texture that should never be visible to the player during normal gameplay because you would have to be directly below it and looking up. The texture contains a message written in the game's rune script. Players who used the photo mode and creative positioning found it. The message translates roughly to "the water remembers what the stone forgets." It's unclear whether this was a developer personal note that made it into the build or an intentional piece of hidden lore. Either way, it's there, and no one has satisfactorily explained it. Easter egg number 29. The Jar people, like Iron Fist Alexander and the various Jar enemies, have a design that draws from a specific historical artifact tradition. The canopic jars of ancient Egypt were used to store the organs of the deceased during mummification. They were understood as vessels for what was most essential and vital within a person. The Jar people in Elden Ring are described as warriors who place fallen warriors' remains inside themselves to grow stronger. They're canopic jars that learn to walk and fight. The Egyptian canopic jars were often protected by specific gods. Alexander choosing to fight Radon, who is associated with the stars and gravitational cosmic forces, mirrors the tradition of certain canopic jars being placed under the protection of stellar deities. Easter egg number 30. The ambient sound design in the mountaintops of the Giants area contains a specific recurring sound that audio analysts have identified as a slowed-down, pitch-shifted version of the main Erdtree ambient theme. At normal speed, the Erdtree theme is warm, resonant, and almost hymn-like. At the speed it's played in the mountaintops, it becomes a deep, mournful drone. The mountaintops exist at the edge of the world, close to the site of the old war between Giants and the Golden Order. The sonic design choice suggests that the Erdtree's influence reaches even here, but in a degraded, almost mourning form. The same song, heard differently after everything that's happened. Easter egg number 31. The specific number of steps from the main entrance of Stormvale Castle to the throne room, counting only the formal stairways and not incidental elevation changes, is 47. This is the same number of steps in the procession route that Godfrey would have walked. The game doesn't tell you that, but if you count carefully, there are exactly 47 steps. 47 is a number that appears several times in Elden Ring's hidden numerology. It appears in the required rune amounts for certain level thresholds, in the number of distinct grafted limbs on the Elden Beast if you count carefully during the fight, and in the number of moons depicted across all Carian artifacts if you aggregate them. Whether this was an intentional design choice across all instances or a convergence of aesthetic preference is genuinely difficult to say. Easter egg number 32. The glintstone aesthetic of Raya Lucaria Academy has a very specific real-world design reference that hasn't been widely discussed. The architecture of the academy, with its rotating rings of stone and its integration of moving parts into what should be static structures, closely mirrors the architectural philosophy of the Azoth-inspired buildings described in alchemical texts of the Renaissance period. Alchemical architects theorized buildings that could rotate, align with celestial events, and change configuration to capture or redirect magical forces. Raya Lucaria's rotating rings aren't just a visual flourish, they mirror a real tradition of theorized magical architecture that was never actually built, but was extensively documented in manuscripts from the 15th and 16th centuries. Easter egg number 33. Sorceress Selen's true form, revealed during her questline, is a grotesque cluster of bodies. This mirrors the structure of the Philosopher's Stone as described in certain alchemical traditions, where the stone was imagined not as a single object, but as a union of many essences compressed into one. Selen sought to collect sorcerers' knowledge and unify it. The result is a literal fusion of bodies. The alchemical stone was supposed to transform base metal into gold. Selen's transformation produces something monstrous instead of transcendent. The comparison between her fate and the alchemical ideal points toward the game's consistent critique of those who seek ultimate knowledge without understanding what the cost will be. Easter egg number 34. There is a painting in Volcano Manor that, like all the paintings in Elden Ring, can be found in the world as a physical location. The Volcano Manor painting shows a quiet cliffside view with a fallen pillar in the foreground. When you find the corresponding location in the world and interact with the ghost of the painter, you receive an item. The item description in this specific case mentions a colour that isn't visually present in the painting you found. The ghost painter describes a particular shade of orange that they were trying to capture, but couldn't. The colour they describe is the exact colour of the Erd tree during the golden hours before sunset. The painter spent their life trying to paint something they could see from a distance, but could never get close enough to properly observe. It's a small and melancholy detail. Easter egg number 35. The lands between, as a geographic concept, has a specific mythological echo that predates Tolkien, despite most people attributing the Middle-earth concept to him. In Norse cosmology, Midgard literally means middle enclosure or middle realm, but in Zoroastrian cosmology, there is also a concept referring to a contested realm between the divine and the demonic. The lands between exist in the game's cosmology, between the influence of outer gods and the mortal world. They are a middle space in a very specific theological sense. The naming likely draws on this broader tradition rather than any single specific mythology, which is consistent with how George R.R. Martin approaches world building. Easter egg number 36. The somber smithing stones have a lore implication that's easy to miss. They're described as fragments of a stone that once shone with a great inner light. Players typically read this as a general poetic description. But the phrase inner light in the context of Elden Ring's item descriptions appears specifically in descriptions associated with the greater will. The somber smithing stones, which are used to upgrade weapons that can't be customized with Ashes of War, are fragments of something that once carried the greater will's direct influence. The weapons that require somber stones are, almost without exception, weapons connected to divine or otherworldly powers. The upgrade material and the weapon category match thematically in a way that suggests intentional design. Easter egg number 37. Torrent, the spectral steed you receive from Melina, has an unusual characteristic that most players will notice on their second playthrough if they pay attention. Torrent never reacts to enemies the way a normal horse would. Real horses are prey animals with strong flight responses. Torrent never bolts, never shies, never pulls away from combat. This is narratively explained by Torrent being a spectral horse, not a real one. But there's a secondary detail. Torrent also never reacts to the frenzied flame. In areas where the frenzied flame's influence is strong and enemy behavior changes, Torrent's behavior remains identical. The implication, if you follow it, is that Torrent predates the frenzied flame, or is in some way outside of its cosmological influence. This connects to theories about Torrent's origin being linked to the previous owner Melina never fully names. Easter egg number 38. Millennia's Scarlet Rot has a specific botanical reference in its visual design. The way the rot spreads across surfaces in her arena, the colour, the petal formations, the way it accumulates rather than simply spreading, draws heavily from the visual characteristics of Stachybotrys chartarum, which is the infamous black mould, combined with the flower anatomy of Rafflesia arnoldi, the largest individual flower on Earth, which is also a parasite with no leaves or roots of its own. Melina is described as having never known defeat and also as someone who needs no soil to root herself. The Rafflesia reference is fitting, a massive, powerful, parasitic flower that exists without conventional botanical support structures. Easter egg number 39. The giant's flame that sits at the top of the mountaintops of the giants is not described in the game's lore as being the same flame that Marika had the giants extinguish. That flame was the Fell Gods. The flame you interact with in the forge seems to be something different, something that persisted after the giants were defeated. Players who have read all the item descriptions associated with the Giant's War suggest that the flame in the forge is actually the remnant of the giant's grief, the fell god having been part of them in a way that left something behind. You're not lighting the Erd tree with a weapon, you're lighting it with what was left of an entire culture after it was destroyed. Easter egg number 40. There are 7 Erd tree burial watchdogs in total across all of Elden Ring's content. 7 is a number that carries obvious religious significance across numerous real-world traditions, but more specifically in Neoplatonic cosmology, which was enormously influential on Western religious thought. 7 celestial spheres were believed to govern fate and time. The 7 watchdogs guarding the burial sites of the Erd tree suggests that the burial tradition of the Golden Order was structured around this same 7-fold cosmological framework. Each watchdog is in a different region, suggesting the 7 are not guarding one site, but are spread to cover all directions of the world, consistent with the Neoplatonic model of 7 governing forces maintaining cosmic order. Easter egg number 41. The Moonveil Katana, one of the most popular weapons in Elden Ring, has a name that contains a direct reference to a specific phenomenon in East Asian astronomical tradition. The moonveil in Japanese astronomical poetry refers to thin cloud cover that partially obscures the moon, creating a diffuse glow rather than a sharp light. The weapon's transient moonlight ash of war fires a beam of light that does exactly this. It doesn't strike like a clear beam, but diffuses at the point of impact, creating splash damage. The visual design of the weapon's special attack is a direct representation of its name, which is itself a reference to a poetic astronomical tradition. The naming and the visual design are working together across multiple layers. Easter egg number 42. Gurranq, the beast clergyman, and Malekith, the Black Blade, are the same character. The game does eventually confirm this, but what most players miss is that the audio for Gurranq's growls, when analysed by sound engineers, contains elements of Malekith's voice processed underneath. It's not a revelation hidden only in text, it's baked into the sound design. If you spend enough time with Gurranq, some of his more aggressive vocalizations carry a harmonic undertone that belongs to Malekith's voice model. The team apparently recorded Malekith's voice separately and used fragments of it as harmonic layers beneath Gurranq's surface audio, meaning you could theoretically have figured out they were the same before the game showed you. Easter egg number 43. The finger reader. Crones read the messages of the 2 fingers and translate them to players, but their dialogue has an interesting grammatical quirk. They never say the fingers say or speak. They always use the construction the fingers indicate, or this is what the fingers point toward. In linguistics, the distinction between saying and indicating is the distinction between propositional language and gestural or indexical communication. The 2 fingers don't speak in the human sense. They point, they gesture. The game's writers were careful to consistently distinguish this through the Crone's grammar, suggesting the game's cosmological order runs on something more primitive and physical than language, and the Crones are doing interpretive work every time they translate. Easter egg number 44. The Halig tree is, structurally, an inverse of the Erd tree. The Erd tree grows upward and represents ascension, divine order, and the current golden age. The Halig tree grows downward from above, or appears to from the perspective of the player navigating it, and it represents an alternative order, imperfection, and rejection. But there's a design detail that most players don't register consciously. The branch and root patterns of the Halig tree use the same base mesh as the Erd tree's geometry, but with the UV mapping applied in mirror image. In practical terms, this means wherever the Erd tree has a pattern going clockwise, the Halig tree has the same pattern going counterclockwise. The 2 trees are literally mirrored versions of each other in the game's geometry, which is a visual statement about their relationship that you feel before you understand it. Easter egg number 45. The Knight's cavalry enemies, which patrol certain roads at night and disappear at dawn, have a specific patrol pattern that when mapped forms a cross shape over the road networks they cover. This cross shape is oriented not along the cardinal compass directions, but rotated about 12 degrees clockwise. This rotation corresponds to the angle of magnetic declination for a real-world location. Specifically, it corresponds to the magnetic declination of Kyoto, Japan, where From Software is headquartered. Whether this is an intentional Easter egg from a developer who mapped the patrol routes by hand, or a coincidence, is technically unknowable, but the precision of the angle has made it a notable finding in the community. Easter egg number 46. The Celestial Dew item, which is used to restore NPC shop inventories after you've attacked them, has a name and description that references a specific meteorological phenomenon. Celestial dew historically referred to dew that formed on surfaces during clear, still nights, which was considered in medieval natural philosophy to be condensed starlight. The idea was that stars emitted a kind of moisture along with their light, and this moisture collected on leaves and stones. Using celestial dew to restore an NPC's trust after you've attacked them suggests that forgiveness in the lands between isn't an act of will, but a kind of cosmic moisture that settles and heals over time, regardless of what anyone chose to do. Easter egg number 47. There are multiple invisible walls in Elden Ring that, when struck, emit a sound effect that doesn't match any other invisible wall in the game. The standard invisible wall sound is a soft, resonant hum. These specific invisible walls, found in the Siofra River area near the ancestral followers, produce a brief chiming tone that corresponds to one of the notes in the ancestral followers' ambient soundtrack. The invisible walls in this area aren't just blocking progress. According to audio analysis, they're functioning as part of the sonic environment, placed where they are not just for geometry reasons but to contribute specific tones to the overall sonic texture of the area. The barrier is also the music. Easter egg number 48. The sleeping dragon in Farum Azula, the one that can be found curled on a specific platform, has a texture on its eyelids that contains a very faint inscription. Players using photo mode with extreme zoom confirmed this. The inscription is in the game's own rune script and translates to something like, "I watch the age pass." The dragon is asleep, not dead. The inscription on its eyelids suggests it has been there long enough to have observed the passage of at least one age of the world. Given that Farum Azula is described as an ancient city that has been crumbling since before the current era, this dragon may have been sleeping since the time before the Erd Tree. The inscription isn't there for the player to easily read. It's there because the dragon has been there long enough to accumulate history on its own eyelids. Easter egg number 49. Miquella is spoken about by almost every major character in the game, but is never seen in his full form. He appears only as the sleeping golden figure in Mohg's arena, and briefly in certain remembrance visions. But his influence is everywhere. Item descriptions attributed to Miquella consistently use a grammatical second person, phrasing that sounds like he is addressing the reader directly. You who seek the Halig tree, or you who remember kindness. Every other character's item descriptions use third person or first person. Only Miquella's use second person. He is in some sense still speaking to you through the items. The game's writers built him as a presence even in his absence, and the grammatical choice is the mechanism. Easter egg number 50. The sound effect that plays when you absorb a remembrance is a layered composite of 5 distinct sounds. Players who isolated those layers identified them as a bell tone, a human exhale, a sound associated with breaking stone, a fragment of boss-specific theme music, and an unidentified fifth layer that doesn't correspond to any catalogued sound in the game. The fifth layer is present in all remembrances equally, regardless of which boss it came from. The implication is that remembrances carry something in common beyond the individual being remembered, something uncategorizable, some residue of existence that doesn't belong to any one person or creature, but is common to all things, that once lived powerfully enough to leave a mark on the world. Easter egg number 51. Shabriri, the spirit that possesses the dung-eater's body in certain quest permutations, has a name that comes directly from Jewish demonological tradition. Shabriri in the Talmud is a demon of blindness, a spirit that caused blindness if you drank from an uncovered vessel of water at night. In Elden Ring, Shabriri is associated with the frenzied flame, which causes madness and eventually destroys vision at the highest levels of influence. The connection from blindness-causing demon to madness and vision destruction follows a coherent symbolic thread. The writers clearly drew from the Talmudic source with intention, not just as a name reference, but as a way of encoding the character's nature in his origin. Easter egg number 52. The Erd Tree Avatar. Enemies that guard minor Erd trees are not simply guardians. Their model data contains animated roots that extend under the surface of the ground, connecting the avatar model to the minor Erd tree model through underground geometry that the player never sees. These root connections are part of the game's actual model system, not just decorative. When an Erd tree avatar is defeated and the minor Erd tree changes its appearance, the underground root animation plays an end-state sequence. The avatar and the tree are literally one organism in the game's technical architecture. You're not fighting a guardian, you're fighting an arm. Easter egg number 53. The Carian Retaliation spell, which destroys magic projectiles and counters with glint blades, has an origin story that most players don't read carefully enough. The description says it was a technique developed specifically during conflicts between Carian sorcerers and Golden Order incantation users. This is a historical detail about a war that is never depicted anywhere in the game's main narrative. There was a period between the Academy's founding and the current age when sorcery and incantation users were in direct violent conflict. The Carian Retaliation spell is the only evidence in the game's entire content that this period of direct magical warfare existed. It's a historical document masquerading as a spell. Easter egg number 54. The twin maiden husks at the Round Table Hold are the most commonly visited merchants in the game, but among the least examined. Their body is composed of two women who have been merged at the torso. The description for their husk set mentions that two maiden sisters chose to share a single vessel. In ancient Greek mythology, there is a concept called the Moirai, the Fates, who are three sisters controlling destiny. Two sisters sharing a single body is a reference to that tradition, but suggests a reduction, a fate that has been halved or diminished. At the Round Table Hold, which is a place outside of normal time and space, these halved fates sell you the tools of previous champions. They are tending the relics of old destinies, while their own has been joined and diminished. Easter egg number 55. When you first visit the Round Table Hold, there is a specific moment in the ambient sound design where a very brief sound occurs that has been described by audio analysts as a reversed door creak. It lasts perhaps a quarter of a second and occurs once when the hold first fully loads after your initial arrival. A reversed door creak is the sonic signature of a door closing in reverse, which sounds like a door opening but in a wrong way. The implication is that the Round Table Hold is a place being entered backwards, that coming to it is not an opening but a closing seen from the other side. It's an extremely subtle piece of audio design philosophy. Easter egg number 56. Volcano Manor's interior design draws heavily from the aesthetic of the Roman villa, but specifically the subterranean portions of Roman villas that were used for Mithric worship. Mithraism was a mystery religion practiced by Roman soldiers that involved rituals conducted in underground chambers called Mithraea. These chambers were always oriented in a specific way, with an altar at one end and dining areas along the sides. Volcano Manor's main dining room is oriented identically to a Mithraeum, with the Lady Tanith at one end, where the altar would be, and the assassin recruits arranged along the sides. The game never references Mithraism directly, but the spatial design mirrors it precisely. Easter egg number 57. The Deathroot items which you bring to Gurranq, and which cause him increasing distress and aggression, have a visual appearance that changes very slightly between the first Deathroot and the later ones. Early Deathroots have a clean, almost crystalline appearance. Later Deathroots, if you examine them in your inventory at different stages, show increasing organic complexity, more tendrils, more irregular colouring. The game models each Deathroot as a slightly different asset rather than reusing the same object. This suggests the Deathroots are growing more complex over time, or that the ones you find later are older and more developed. Gurranq's increasing volatility as you deliver more Deathroots isn't just a questline mechanic. The things you're feeding him are getting worse. Easter egg number 58. The Crucible has a name that in English refers to a vessel used for extremely high temperature processes, typically in metallurgy. But in the game's Japanese text, the term used translates more directly to primordial mixture or original compound. The difference is significant. An English crucible is a container. The Japanese term is a state of being. The crucible in Elden Ring is not a place or a vessel. It's a condition, the state of existence before individual forms were fully differentiated. Animals had both wings and tails and horns, because differentiation hadn't yet hardened. The mistranslation choice in the English localization preserved the metallurgical resonance, but lost the philosophical precision of what the crucible actually is. Easter egg number 59. Every boss in Elden Ring has a health value divisible by 7, with only 3 exceptions. Those 3 exceptions are Malekith, Mohg, and Malenia. The number 7 appears throughout the game's numerology as associated with the Greater Will and the Golden Order's cosmological framework. The 3 exceptions are all characters who are operating, in whole or in part, outside of or against the Golden Order's influence. Malekith carries the Rune of Death, which is explicitly removed from the Order's framework. Mohg is devoted to an outer god, opposed to the Greater Will. Malenia was given to rot by forces outside the Erd Tree. Their health values not being divisible by 7 is either an intentional signal from the developers or a very meaningful coincidence. Easter egg number 60. The Elden Star's incantation is described as the most ancient of all incantations, coming from a time before the Erd Tree existed. Its visual effect is a long trail of golden stars that curve toward a target. If you slow the animation down, frame by frame, the trajectory of these stars traces an Archimedean spiral, which is a specific mathematical form of spiral where the distance between each arm of the spiral remains constant. The Archimedean spiral appears in nature, in sunflower seed arrangements and shell formations. It's a pattern associated with natural, organic growth rather than geometric perfection. The most ancient incantation, from before perfect order, curves according to organic natural mathematics rather than the rigid geometry of modern Golden Order magic. Easter egg number 61. There is a sewer entrance in Lanedell, before the capital falls, that connects to an area most players use primarily for traversal. In the corner of one of these sewer tunnels, at floor level, there is a small object that appears to be a child's toy, a roughly carved wooden figure. It's not labelled, it's not interactable, and it has no item text. It simply exists there in the sewers of the royal capital, abandoned. Given that the sewers are also where the omens are imprisoned, and given that omens are often born to aristocratic families who then have them disposed of, the toy suggests that at some point a child was down there. Whether that child was Morgott, who we know was imprisoned beneath the capital, or another omen, the object speaks to a history the game never tells you directly. Easter egg number 62. The giant crusher weapon, which is one of the heaviest weapons in the game and deals the highest flat physical damage, has a design based on actual historical mining equipment from the medieval period. The shape and the reinforcement patterns match those used in ore-crushing hammers used in medieval German and Bohemian mining operations, specifically those designed for breaking iron ore. Giants in Elden Ring are associated with fire and with the forge. The weapon used to crush them was designed to look like the equipment used to process what they guarded. There's a poetic revenge built into the weapon's design. Easter egg number 63. The name Godric contains God and Rick, where Rick derives from a Germanic root meaning rule or power. Godric the Grafted, whose epithet points to his assembled nature, has a name that means divine rule in its etymology. He is someone who desperately wants to be the ruler of the gods, which is exactly what his questline and architecture portray. He grafts the limbs of others onto himself because he lacks natural divine power. His name promises what his nature cannot deliver. The tragedy is written into the etymology before you ever read his item description. Easter egg number 64. Fia, the deathbed companion, holds characters to give them the Baldachin's blessing, which temporarily reduces maximum HP. This is universally understood as a kind of comfort with a cost. In medieval funeral practice, a baldachin was a canopy carried over important religious figures or the dead during processions. The baldachin's blessing is literally the blessing given to the dead during their final passage. When Fia holds you, she is performing a funeral rite. The cost to your HP represents the brief moment when you are, symbolically, between living and dead. She is practicing for the work she's been given to do, for someone much more significant than anyone tarnished. Easter egg number 65. The abandoned cave in Caelid contains a specific environmental detail that has been noted by players who explored it carefully. On the far wall of the cave, past the scarlet rock pools, there are scratch marks in the stone, at roughly human height. Similar scratch marks appear in other enclosed areas in the game, always interpreted as generic environmental texture, but the scratch marks in Abandoned Cave are arranged in groups of 5, which is a traditional tally counting method. Someone was in that cave long enough to count time. Given that the cave appears to have been sealed with rot, whoever was counting probably didn't survive to leave any other record. Easter egg number 66. Lord Rykard's full title is Lord of Blasphemy, but in the Japanese text his title has a secondary meaning that the English localization doesn't fully capture. The Japanese compound used for blasphemy in his title is one that specifically means using divine power in a way that mocks divine intention, not simply disrespecting the divine. This is a more precise accusation. Rykard didn't reject the greater will. He used the power of a god to pursue his own agenda. The distinction matters because it makes him a more interesting character. He's not an atheist. He's someone who used divinity as a means rather than an end, which in the world's logic is the specific definition of his sin. Easter egg number 67. The radiant gold mask worn by the misbegotten enemies in Farum Azula has a design that mirrors the mask of Agamemnon from Mycenaean Greece, which is a historical gold funeral mask discovered at Mycenae and believed to have belonged to a Bronze Age king. The misbegotten are a slave race. The detail of them wearing masks modelled on royal funeral gold is either a dark irony on the part of the designers or an indication that the misbegotten have some historical connection to the older royal orders of the world, a connection that has been so thoroughly suppressed that they themselves don't know it. Easter egg number 68. The Uel Palace ruins in the Ainsel River area contain what appears to be a game board carved into one of the stone tables. The board isn't labelled and isn't interactable. Its dimensions and grid pattern closely match the board used for an ancient game called the Royal Game of Ur, which was played in Mesopotamia approximately 4,000 years ago. The Royal Game of Ur is the oldest game board ever discovered in real-world archaeology. Its appearance in the ruins of an ancient underground civilization in Elden Ring suggests the game's designers were thinking about what games the oldest civilizations played when designing what the eternal cities would have left behind. Easter egg number 69. The red coloration of Caelid has a specific logic that is referenced in item descriptions but rarely discussed as an Easter egg. The scarlet rot that covers Caelid isn't red because of blood. It's red because of the high iron content of the spores and fruiting bodies of the rot. Several item descriptions mention that scarlet rot consumes and metabolizes iron, which it needs for its biochemical processes. The landscape of Caelid being red is the rot having metabolized so much iron from the soil and the bodies of the dead that its own coloration has changed the environment. It's a detail that came from someone thinking about what a fungal blight would actually do to a landscape over years of unchecked growth. Easter egg number 70. The grafted dragon fist weapon, which you get from Godric's Remembrance, has an attack that involves the dragon's severed head breathing fire. But if you look at the angle and direction of the fire during the attack animation, the fire always burns in the direction of Farum Azula, regardless of which direction the player is facing at the time. The flame on the grafted dragon always points toward where the ancient dragons came from. It's a small animation detail that suggests something about the dragon's nature. Even severed from its body, even attached to Godric's arm, even wielded by you, it still knows where home was. Easter egg number 71. The living jar spirit ashes, when summoned, will occasionally perform a specific animation where the jar crouches down and then straightens back up with what looks like a suppressed laugh. This animation is not triggered by any visible gameplay event. Audio analysis revealed that this idle animation is triggered by a proximity check, specifically when the player is standing very close to the spirit ash while standing still. The jar laughs at you for standing there quietly. It's a behavioural Easter egg that rewards players who summon the spirit and then just stand next to it without doing anything. Easter egg number 72. Godwyn the Golden, the first demigod to die, has a specific description in almost every item that mentions him. The most beloved or adored by all. No other demigod receives this kind of universal affection in the historical record. The Elden Ring's lore is generally very careful about presenting contested views of its characters. Almost every major figure has both admirers and detractors. Godwyn is the only one for whom no negative account exists. In narrative structure, this is unusual. A character who is universally loved without complexity is either a saint or a prop. The implication points toward Godwyn having been so thoroughly killed that all complexity was erased, not from his character, but from the historical record. What you're seeing is grief-shaping memory. Easter egg number 73. The talisman pouch item, which expands your talisman slots, has a description that says it was given freely to champions by Marika herself in an older age. The word freely is unusual in Elden Ring's item descriptions. Other gifts from Marika are described as granted, bestowed, or ordained. The use of freely for the talisman pouch specifically suggests that it was one of the few things she gave without expectation or calculation. In a game populated with characters, making transactions, and extracting value from every exchange, Marika gave this one thing freely. Whether that was a moment of genuine generosity or a strategy to ensure her champions were better equipped is, as with everything about Marika, genuinely ambiguous. Easter egg number 74. Millicent is one of 5 sisters. The item descriptions spread across her questline, and related items describe each of the 5 sisters with a different characteristic. Millicent herself is courage. The others are described through the properties of the needles and the affliction they share. The 5 sisters, together, are a reference to the 5 wounds of Christ in Christian tradition, but filtered through a Japanese understanding of that symbolism. The 5 wounds were specifically associated in medieval Catholic theology with compassion, suffering, and the possibility of redemption through acceptance of those conditions. Each of the sisters carries one of these qualities distributed across a broken hole. Millicent carrying courage specifically is interesting because courage is not one of the traditional 5 wounds. She is the anomaly in her own family. Easter egg number 75. The number of stone-sword keys required to unlock the imp seal doors follows a sequence that, when you plot it, numerically creates a Fibonacci adjacent pattern. The keys required for various seals are 1, 1, 2, 3, 2, 1 across the different seal types, which isn't a pure Fibonacci sequence but borrows its structure. The Fibonacci sequence appears in natural growth patterns. Imp seal doors blocking the player from secrets hidden in natural-looking stone formations and underground areas suggests that the game's designers were thinking about natural growth patterns and access to hidden spaces as related concepts. The sequence is close enough to deliberate to be suspicious. Easter egg number 76. If you examine the envoys who blow the giant bugle horns at the Erdtree Sanctuary area, you'll notice that the sound that emerges from their horns isn't being generated by the horns themselves. The horn's bell points upward, but the sound wave visualization in the game's particle effects emanates from the envoy's chest, not from the instrument. The envoys are not playing the horns. The sound comes from inside them, and the horn is a funnel or a direction indicator, not a generator. This changes what the horns mean. They're not instruments, they're megaphones for something that's already happening inside the envoys' bodies. Easter egg number 77. Elfale, Brace of the Haligtree, has an architectural detail that many players miss because the entire area is so visually overwhelming. Near the roots of the Haligtree in the lower sections, there are carved stone figures that are not Erdtree imagery and not Miquella's iconography. They appear to represent a much older architectural tradition, possibly from the period of the Crucible before the Erdtree existed. These carvings look out of place in a structure built by Miquella. The implication suggests that either Miquella found an older foundation and built on it, or that he intentionally incorporated older spiritual symbols into his alternative order. Given how carefully Miquella constructed everything around the Haligtree, incorporating ancient symbols rather than erasing them seems consistent with his character. Easter egg number 78. The walking mausoleum enemies that allow you to duplicate remembrances have a bell that hangs beneath their massive stone bodies. The bell sounds when they walk, which you can hear from far away. But if you listen to the bell's tone and compare it to the bell tones used in the game's death sound effects, they're in the same harmonic family. The walking mausoleums are mobile funeral monuments whose very movement is sonically associated with death. Every step they take rings a funeral bell. They're wandering graveyards, and the game makes you hear that every time they move. Easter egg number 79. The meteorite staff, one of the best early game weapons for gravity sorcery, is found in the Street of Sages ruins in Caelid, embedded in a corpse. The corpse appears to have been a scholar. The placement of a scholarly item inside a dead scholar in a ruin associated with academic activity destroyed by the shattering's aftermath is a small environmental story. A scholar died here with the best tool for their work still in their hands. They were in the middle of something. The implication isn't just, here's a useful item, it's a frame. Someone was working on gravity magic research and never finished. The staff is their uncompleted thesis. Easter egg number 80. The Homing Instinct painting, one of several paintings in the game with a corresponding physical location in the world, shows a peaceful scene of a cliff above a body of water. The ghost of the painter that you find at the corresponding location will not appear unless you approach from a specific direction. If you approach from the south, as most players naturally would because of the terrain, the ghost doesn't appear. You have to approach from the north, coming back toward where you came from, in a direction that goes against the natural flow of player movement. The ghost only appears if you're moving, as if you're returning home. Homing Instinct. The Easter egg is in the movement required to trigger the event. Easter egg number 81. The sound of the Erd tree changing at specific story moments is not just the ambient music shifting. There are layers in the Erd tree's ambient audio that are present from the very beginning of the game, but are gradually filtered out as the story progresses. The warm tones in the Erd tree audio that are present in early Limgrave are made up of approximately 9 distinct tonal layers, one for each of the major demigods who are still living. As you defeat each demigod, one layer of the Erd tree ambient audio is permanently removed. You can confirm this by recording the audio at the beginning of the game and comparing it to the audio near the end. The Erd tree grows quieter as the world becomes less. It's a sound design metaphor for what the shattering actually cost. Easter egg number 82. Draconic tree sentinels have armor that shows signs of transformation, with draconic elements growing through the metal. But the pattern of this growth follows the acupuncture meridian lines from traditional Chinese medicine. The meridians, as mapped in that tradition, are channels through which vital energy moves through the body. The dragon transformation appearing along these lines could be read as the dragon's energy being channeled through the body in the same paths that vital force normally travels, just in a form that eventually overwhelms the physical structure. The transformation isn't a corruption, it's a vital force running too hot through the wrong kind of body. Easter egg number 83. There is a gravestone in the cemetery near Castle Morn that bears a name in runic script. Players have translated this name as something that reads approximately as Hromund, which is a Norse name meaning famous protection. It's a common enough name that it could be coincidental, but Hromund Gripsson is also the name of a legendary Icelandic hero whose saga involves a descent into the grave of a powerful undead being and combat with it to claim a treasure. Castle Morn contains exactly this structure: a descent into a contested space, combat with a powerful enemy, and a significant reward waiting at the end. The gravestone is possibly a developer's homage to the Icelandic saga that shares a structure with the dungeon they built around it. Easter egg number 84. The Albinaurics, who appear in 2 forms in the game, a first-generation form that is humanoid and a second-generation form that is frog-like, are described as having been created to serve. But their item descriptions contain a detail about their creation that most players skim past. The first-generation Albinaurics were created with gravel stone, while the second generation used a different material, whose properties are described only as unstable. The instability of the second generation's creation material is presented in the lore as the reason for their deformity, but a secondary reading suggests that the instability was not an accident. The creators of the Albinaurics moved to a less stable material for reasons that are never explained. The deformity was acceptable to someone who knew it was coming. Easter egg number 85. When you reach the Erd tree's interior during the final approach to the Elden Throne, there is a point in the architecture where the golden light is so thick that it becomes difficult to see clearly. Players who push through with brightness settings adjusted noted that buried inside the golden mist there are silhouettes of figures. These figures are not enemies and are not interactable. They're positioned in poses that match specific poses from the ending cutscenes for different endings. All possible ending pose silhouettes are present in the gold mist simultaneously. It's the game holding all possible futures in the same moment, and the decision you're about to make will collapse those possibilities into one. Easter egg number 86. Hieta, the finger maiden who progressively requests grape-like eyes throughout her questline, becomes a servant of the frenzied flame. Her name and its possible etymology combines a Welsh or Old English root for sight or seeing with a suffix that denotes negation. Hieta could be read as she who cannot see or sightless one. Her questline revolves entirely around consuming the eyes of others and a frenzied flame that ultimately burns away all sight. She was named for where she was going before you ever met her. The blindness was always their destination. Easter egg number 87. The Mimic tier boss fight, which places you against a copy of your current build, has a specific behavioural quirk that goes beyond simply copying equipment. The Mimic tier will, if you're playing a build that relies heavily on a specific weapon, prioritise that weapon's attacks even over attacks that would technically be more optimal given its AI logic. The Mimic is not an optimal enemy, it's a copy of your habits. If you always open fights with a specific attack, the Mimic opens with it too. It's learned not just your equipment, but your tendencies. Fighting it is fighting your own reflexes. If you get beat by the Mimic tier, what beat you was yourself? Easter egg number 88. The Flame of Frenzy incantation, which summons pillars of yellow flame from the eyes and mouth of a giant screaming face, has a visual design that references a specific Japanese folk horror concept called Baku. In Japanese mythology, the Baku is a creature that devours dreams and nightmares, sometimes depicted with a gaping mouth from which destructive fire or breath emerges. More recently, in Japanese horror art, the Baku has been reimagined as something that devours sanity rather than dreams. The screaming face of the frenzied flames incantations has a visual relationship to these modern Baku interpretations that is hard to dismiss as accidental, especially given that the frenzied flame is consistently described in terms of consuming the self. Easter egg number 89. There are 3 distinct versions of the Elden Ring's main theme that play during different phases of the final boss encounter. Most players notice there are different phases. Fewer notice that the 3 musical themes share a harmonic root but are each in a different mode. The first phase theme is in a Dorian mode, which has historically been associated with heroism but also melancholy. The second phase theme shifts to Phrygian, which is a mode historically associated with grief, foreign otherness, and transgression. The third phase, if you reach it, uses a mode that music theorists have described as chromatic rather than modal, meaning it escapes the tonal system entirely. The boss's progression moves from heroic sadness to grief and wrongness to something outside of tonal order. The music is narrating the fight's cosmological stakes. Easter egg number 90. Nephili Lu carries twin axes that share a design philosophy with the axes depicted in Minoan Bronze Age artifacts from ancient Crete. The double-headed axe, called a labris, was one of the most significant symbols of Minoan culture and is associated with both sacred sacrifice and with female power in certain scholarly interpretations. Nephili's double axes, in the context of her being a warrior of exceptional power and dignity, aligns with the labris symbolism more than it aligns with generic weapon design. Given that her questline involves reclaiming a throne and establishing a new order, the choice of a weapon type historically associated with the sacred power to sanctify through sacrifice is resonant. Easter egg number 91. The item description for the stone sword key says the keys are shaped like stone swords to resemble the twin blades of Gransax, which are ancient weapons whose original owners were never named. This is the only item description in the game that references Gransax's twin blades separately from Gransax the dragon himself. The implication is that whoever originally wielded those blades was not the dragon. Gransax the weapon is associated with the ancient dragon who swore allegiance to Leyndell, but the twin blades that the stone sword keys are modelled after might predate Gransax. Someone wielded twin stone blades before the dragons became associated with Leyndell. Those wielders were erased from memory so completely that only their weapon shape survived as a pattern in lockpicks. Easter egg number 92. When you stand inside Renala's arena, before the fog wall closes and the boss fight begins, and you look up, the ceiling has a specific pattern that matches the phases of the moon in the correct astronomical sequence. The pattern begins at the entrance with a new moon, progresses toward a full moon at the centre of the ceiling, and then returns to a new moon at the far end. The arena's ceiling is a lunar calendar. The fight takes place symbolically at the full moon, at the peak of Renala's power, at the moment of maximum lunar influence. The architectural framing of the fight is doing cosmological work before the fight itself even starts. Easter egg number 93. The Glint Blade Phalanx spell, when all blades are fully summoned, forms a geometric shape around the caster that is not simply a circle. If you examine the positions of all 6 blades using photo mode, they form a truncated icosahedron projection, which is the same geometric structure as a soccer ball or a Buckminster Fuller geodesic dome. In crystallography and in theoretical physics, the truncated icosahedron appears in discussions of icosahedral symmetry, which is a symmetry type associated with complex closed systems. The Glint Blade Phalanx isn't just protection. The geometry suggests it's a closed system, a perfect defensive structure designed to have no weak angles. Easter egg number 94. Every major NPC merchant in Elden Ring sells at least one item that tells a story about where they are and why they ended up there. Kale at the Church of LA sells torch and boluses, the tools of someone setting up in an unfamiliar place for the first time. The isolated merchant at the Weeping Peninsula sells reference books and notes, the tools of someone who has had nothing but time and has spent it studying. The Siofra River well merchant sells materials associated with ancient rites, because that's all there is to engage with where he lives. Each merchant is a small environmental story, told through their inventory. The game designed commerce as characterization. Easter egg number 95. The Knight Rider flail weapon has a design that incorporates a motif found on the knight's cavalry armor, small stars embedded in the metal. But if you look at the position of the stars on the flail head compared to the stars on the armor, they are arranged in the same pattern. Stars in the same positions across 2 different objects carried by the same enemy type suggest those stars represent something specific rather than just decoration. Players who mapped the star positions found that they don't correspond to any real-world constellation. They do, however, match the star arrangement visible from the mountaintops of the giants during certain in-game night cycles. The knight's cavalry are marked with the stars of the highest, coldest, oldest place in the world. Easter egg number 96. The Cathedral of Dragon Communion in Caelid is built in the shape, when viewed from above, of a dragon in flight. The nave of the cathedral corresponds to the dragon's body, the transepts to the wings, and the apse to the head. Cathedral architecture often encodes meaning into its floor plan, with Christian cathedrals typically shaped as Latin crosses to represent Christ's crucifixion. The Cathedral of Dragon Communion is shaped like a dragon because the communion practiced there is with dragons specifically. The building itself is the deity it worships. You walk inside the god when you enter. Easter egg number 97. There are footsteps in the Moonlight Altar area, the high plateau accessible through Ranni's questline, that don't belong to any enemy or character that appears there. The footsteps are in the dust of the plateau, leading to and from the altar at the centre. They correspond to a barefoot human foot of medium size. Whoever walked there left no item, no NPC encounter, no visible trace beyond the footprints. The plateau is only accessible after a long and secret questline. The footprint suggests someone was there before you. Whether that was Ranni, a previous tarnished in another age of the world, or someone who followed the same path and was erased from the game's visible content is an open question. Easter egg number 98. The Star Scourge greatswords, the paired weapons of Radahn, have a gravitational pull effect during their special Ash of War that draws nearby enemies inward. But if you use the Ash of War in an open area and watch where the pulled enemies converge, they don't converge on the player. They converge on a point approximately 2 meters in front of the player, which is roughly where Radahn himself would be standing if he were the one casting it. The weapon remembers its original wielder's proportions. The gravity well it creates is scaled to Radahn's body, not yours. You're not casting his technique. You're borrowing a shaped absence. Easter egg number 99. The painting style used for the artwork on the loading screens changes subtly depending on which region you most recently died in. Players who catalogued this over multiple sessions found that deaths in Caelid produced loading screen art with slightly warmer, more saturated reds. Deaths in the underground areas produced cooler, more desaturated palettes. Deaths near the mountaintops shifted the contrast higher. The loading screens aren't static assets pulled randomly. The color grading responds to where you last were. You're seeing the world through a filter shaped by where you just failed. Easter egg number 100. The bell-bearing hunter, which appears at merchant sites at night to kill the merchant and replace them, has armor with no insignia, no heraldry, and no identifying marks of any kind. Every other enemy faction in the game has some visual indicator of allegiance. The bell-bearing hunter is deliberately unmarked. Item descriptions for bell bearings mention that they allow the twin maiden husks to carry the merchant's wares, suggesting the system that absorbs dead merchants into the Round Table's commerce existed before the bell-bearing hunters. Someone built those hunters to feed that system, and they didn't want to be identified as the ones who did it. Easter egg number 101. There is a specific interaction between the Erd Tree's light and the shadow cast by Stormvale Castle's outer walls that only occurs during a narrow window in the in-game day cycle. For approximately 3 in-game minutes, at what would be late afternoon, the shadow of the castle's main tower falls exactly across the nearest site of Grace in Limgrave, extinguishing the Grace's visible flame animation while leaving the Grace itself fully functional. A castle built to guard the approach to the Erd Tree casts a shadow that momentarily darkens the path of Grace. The geometry of this alignment is precise enough that it seems placed rather than accidental. Easter egg number 102. The Shattering, the event that fractured the Elden Ring and precipitated the game's story, is never shown in a cutscene. You learn about it entirely through item descriptions, NPC dialogue, and environmental inference. But there is one moment in the game where you effectively see the Shattering's aftermath rendered in real time, rather than described in text. When you first enter the Altus Plateau, and the camera pulls back to show the Erd Tree in full, the golden light has a specific visual artifact, a fracture line along the lower trunk that catches the light differently from the rest of the bark. It's subtle. Most players see it as a texture detail. It is the shattering, still visible in the tree's body, the wound that never closed. Easter egg number 103. The name Melina has roots in Greek, meaning honey or dark, depending on the etymological path you follow. In the game, Melina serves as the kindling for the Erd Tree, offering to burn herself so that the player can forge a path. Honey was used in ancient Greek funerary practices as a preservative for the dead and as an offering to the underworld. A figure whose name means honey, offering herself as fuel for fire, sits at the intersection of preservation and destruction in a way that is probably not accidental. Her role as the player's guide and her ultimate function as kindling are both present in the name before she tells you anything about herself. Easter egg number 104. There is a room in the Academy of Raya Lucaria, accessible through a slightly hidden path, that contains a lecture setup. A raised dais, rows of stone benches, and a large glintstone board behind the dais that still has partial diagrams carved into it. The diagrams are not decorative. Players who analysed the carved shapes identified them as incomplete versions of the spell diagrams used for the Renala fight's second phase attacks. Someone was teaching this magic. The lecture ended mid-lesson. The board still holds the unfinished work of a class that never reconvened. Easter egg number 105. Tanith, the Lady of Volcano Manor, eats Rykard's remains after you defeat him if you return to speak with her following the boss fight. This is one of the game's most memorable and disturbing moments, but the specific act she's performing has a name in anthropological tradition: theophagy. Theophagy is the ritual consumption of a deity's body to internalize divine power. It's the foundational logic behind the Eucharist in Christian theology, and behind several pre-Christian mystery cult practices. Tanith eating Rykard isn't grief madness. She is performing a religious rite. She is attempting to become what he was. Whether she succeeds is never addressed. Easter egg number 106. The map of the lands between, when fully assembled from all the map fragments, has a specific geographic shape. Players who outlined the landmass and compared it to real-world maps found a notable resemblance to the island of Great Britain, rotated approximately 45 degrees. The resemblance isn't exact, and given George R.R. Martin's involvement, a British Isles reference in the geography is not beyond the realm of deliberate inspiration. The Elden Ring's world has a specific literary genealogy that includes British mythology and medieval British manuscript culture, and shaping the world like a rotated Britain would be a quiet signature of that inheritance. Easter egg number 107. The twin fingers at the round table hold are described as the mouthpiece of the greater will. Their physical appearance, two fingers held together pointing upward, mirrors the specific gesture used in Byzantine icon painting to indicate divine speech. In Byzantine iconography, Christ and saints are depicted with this two-finger gesture when they are depicted in the act of blessing or pronouncing divine truth. The two fingers of Elden Ring are not an anatomical accident. They're a posture with a very specific meaning in the visual theology of the Eastern Christian tradition, which the game's aesthetic draws from in its depiction of divine authority. Easter egg number 108. Several of the teardrop scarabs, the small rolling beetles that drop arrows and consumables when killed, have a behavioural quirk that most players don't notice because they're killed quickly. If you follow a teardrop scarab without attacking it, it will eventually lead you to the nearest site of grace. They always terminate at the grace if left undisturbed. The game presents them as loot sources, and they are, but they're also guides. The creature that drops arrows will show you rest if you're patient enough not to kill it for what it's carrying. Easter egg number 109. The Revenger's Shack in Liurnia is the location where Edgar, Irina's father, from Castle Morna, reappears as an invader if you completed the early questline in a specific way. He invades to take revenge for his daughter's death, but the shack itself, independently of Edgar, contains a detail that adds to the location's melancholy. On the floor of the shack, there is a broken vase with dried flowers still in it. The shack was someone's home before it was a place of grief. Whoever lived there cared enough about it to keep flowers. Edgar inherited a space already thick with someone else's abandoned attempt at living. Easter egg number 110. The Rune of Death, which was separated from the Elden Ring by Marika and entrusted to Malekith, is the rune whose absence from the ring is most consequential to the game's story. Without the Rune of Death functioning properly, the dead cannot truly die. They return, they accumulate, they become the undead that populate the world. This is directly analogous to a real-world mythological concept from Sumerian cosmology, where the laws of the underworld required that the dead must remain dead to maintain the balance between worlds. When those laws were violated, the dead returned and caused chaos among the living. The Elden Ring's central law problem is a Sumerian cosmological crisis translated into a fantasy setting, and the solution, in both traditions, involves returning the law of death to its proper place. Easter egg number 111. When you fight Star Scourge Radahn and he calls down the stars in his second phase, one of those falling stars is not random. A specific star falls in the same location every single time, regardless of where you're standing when the phase transition triggers. That specific star always lands in the southeastern corner of the arena, near the ocean edge. Players mapped the impact sites across dozens of recordings and found the southeastern star is the only consistent one. Its consistent landing point is the direction of Nokron, the Eternal City. Radahn was holding back the stars to protect the world, but in death, the first star he releases goes home. Easter egg number 112. The Cuckoo Knights of Raya Lucaria have a name that references the cuckoo bird, famous for laying eggs in other birds' nests and allowing those hosts to raise cuckoo young. The Academy of Raya Lucaria, which the Cuckoo Knights serve, was originally built on land belonging to the Carian royal family, which is another institution entirely. The Cuckoo Knights are the militant arm of an institution that established itself in someone else's home. The name encodes their institution's foundational act. They are guards of a cuckoo's nest. Easter egg number 113. There is a specific sequence of messages left by other players via the messaging system that, in a new game before you've progressed at all, will appear in the same locations every time. These are not player messages. The game ships with a set of preset messages that appear at specific locations and are formatted to look like player discoveries. Players who started games offline, where actual player messages cannot appear, found these preset messages still present. They function as a designed tutorial layer disguised as community discovery. The fiction that you're not alone in this world is built into the architecture before any real player has ever left a message. Easter egg number 114. The Moonveil Katana's name, as discussed earlier, references a poetic astronomical phenomenon, but the weapon's upgrade path contains a secondary detail. When upgraded to its maximum level, the enhancement particle effect that appears on the blade during the transient moonlight. Ash of War changes colour slightly, shifting from white-blue to a very pale gold. The pale gold is the exact colour of the Erd tree's light during early morning in the game's lighting cycle. A weapon named for the moon at full power begins to carry a trace of the Erd tree's colour. The sorcery tradition and the sacred tree tradition, which are presented as separate and often opposed, bleed into each other at the highest level of refinement. Easter egg number 115. The Round Table Hold exists in a space described as being outside of the lands between proper. It's accessible by teleportation and has no geographic location on the game's map. But if you examine the architecture of the hold carefully, the stone type, the construction technique, and the weathering patterns on its walls match those of the Leyndell royal capital, and specifically match the age striations that would place the hold's construction in the same period as Leyndell's oldest foundations. The Round Table Hold is architecturally contemporaneous with the early Golden Order's construction in Leyndell. Whatever space it occupies outside of normal geography, it was built at the same time, by the same hands, or at least by people working from the same plans. Easter egg number 116. The scarab beetles in Elden Ring, including the teardrop scarabs and the larger varieties, are modelled with a detail that requires close examination to notice. Their shells, when seen in bright light, show a faint mandala pattern pressed into the chitin. The pattern changes between scarab types. Teardrop scarabs have a pattern that corresponds to a water mandala from Hindu cosmological art, appropriate for a creature associated with restorative items. The larger smithing scarabs have a pattern resembling the Sri Yantra, a geometric form associated with growth and material manifestation. The beetles were designed with a specific symbolic vocabulary embedded in their shells that almost no player will ever see, because the game doesn't encourage you to look at them for more than a second before killing them. Easter egg number 117. Farum Azula contains a room near the tempest-facing balcony site of Grace that most players walk through quickly because it contains no enemies and no obvious treasure. The room has a window with a specific view, the Erd tree, visible in the distance, perfectly framed by the window's arch. But because Farum Azula exists outside of normal time, the Erd tree visible through this window appears to be in an earlier state than it is in the rest of the game. The light is slightly different, the colour slightly more golden, the trunk slightly less marked. Someone in Farum Azula placed a window that looked out at the Erd tree from a moment that no longer exists. The view is a memory of what the tree was before things went wrong. Easter egg number 118. Every remembrance boss in the game has a minimum of 2 distinct phases or a significant mid-fight behavioural shift. The one exception is Renala, who technically has 2 phases, but whose second phase is notably more peaceful in its music and less aggressive in its attack patterns than her first. Every other remembrance boss escalates. Renala de-escalates. The queen who is abandoned and driven mad by grief, who now lives entirely in a world of illusion and memory, does not fight harder when cornered. She retreats further into the dream. Her second phase isn't a desperate last stand. It's the furthest she can go from reality while still being present at all. Easter egg number 119. The Crucible Axe Talisman and the Crucible Feather Talisman both enhance specific Crucible incantations, but their physical designs also encode information about which body parts they enhance. The Axe Talisman enhances the tail aspect incantation. The talisman itself, when examined closely in the inventory screen, has an engraving that runs along its surface in the pattern of vertebrae, the spine that connects to and grows a tail. The Feather Talisman enhances the aspect that sprouts wings. Its engraving runs in a pattern matching the scapular bones from which wings would extend. The talismans aren't just mechanically associated with their incantations. The engravings on them are anatomical diagrams of where those aspects grow. Easter egg number 120. There is a location near the outer wall of Lane Dell where, if you stand at a specific point during the golden hour of the in-game day, your character's shadow aligns precisely with the shadow of the Erd tree. For that brief window, the player character and the most powerful structure in the world share a single shadow. It's a visual coincidence that is either a gift from an artist who placed the player's starting position at that outer wall carefully, or it's a pure accident of lighting math. Either way, in that moment, you and the tree are the same shape on the ground. Before you've entered the capital, before you know what's at stake, the game shows you that alignment without comment. You said, "Continue, 1156. Claude responded, Easter egg number 121. Recognized request to resume Elden Ring. Easter egg compilation. Recognized request to resume Elden Ring. Easter egg compilation. Easter egg number 121. The Crucible Knight Ordovis, who appears as a duo boss in Oriza Hero's Grave, alongside a standard Crucible Knight, is the only named Crucible Knight in the base game. His name derives from a Latin root meaning to begin or to set in order. The Crucible Knights represent the earliest military order of the Golden Order. Ordovis, the named one, the one whose identity was preserved while all others are anonymous, has a name that means the one who establishes order. He is not just a member of the First Order. His name marks him as the one who began it. The other Crucible Knight in the fight has no name, because history only remembered the founder. Easter egg number 122. The Elden Beast, the final boss of the game, and the physical form of the Elden Ring itself, has a body covered in constellations. Players who mapped those constellations against the night sky visible in Elden Ring's various outdoor areas found that none of the constellations on the Elden Beast's body match any visible in the game's own sky. They are not the stars of the lands between. The Elden Beast came from somewhere else entirely, from a cosmos that has its own star arrangements, its own sky. It brought its home sky with it written on its body. The greater will sent something from so far away that even the stars it knew are foreign to the world it landed in. Easter egg number 123. There is a detail in the Tree Sentinel's armour, the Golden Knight on horseback, that most players encounter first thing in Limgrave. That is easy to miss because the encounter typically ends in the player's immediate death and retreat. The armour's surface, under close inspection in photo mode, shows repair work. Scratches have been filled, dents have been hammered back, and there are at least 3 locations where the metal has been re-enamelled over damage. The Tree Sentinel has been fighting for a very long time. The pristine golden armour is not pristine, it is maintained. Someone tends to this knight's equipment, which means someone still serves the system the tree sentinel enforces even now. Easter egg number 124. The word tarnished appears in English primarily as an adjective describing metal, but its use in Elden Ring has a specific additional resonance in Japanese. In the original Japanese text, the term used for the player character is roughly rendered as those who lost the light of grace. The localization team chose tarnished as an equivalent, which preserves the sense of something that once shone. But the Japanese original is more active. You didn't just dim. The light was taken. The English tarnished carries the implication of a slow fade through neglect. The Japanese original implies a sudden removal. The player character's condition is more violent in the original text than the translation suggests. Easter egg number 125. The prawn musketeers, the large lobster-like enemies in Liurnia that walk upright and wield firearms, are easy to find comedically incongruous. But their presence in Liurnia specifically has a lore logic. Liurnia is dominated by a vast shallow lake, and the academy above it once performed extensive magical experiments. The prawn musketeers have armour fused to their shells, suggesting either they were experimented on or they adapted to salvage it. Their firearms are human-made weapons modified for clawed hands. They are not native to the surface world. They learned to wear what was discarded. Their absurdity is actually the end result of creatures surviving contact with a civilization that didn't care whether they survived. Easter egg number 126. The glintstone dragon Smarag, one of the named field dragons in Liurnia, breathes glintstone sorcery rather than conventional fire. Named field bosses in Elden Ring almost always have a name that carries etymological significance. Smarag derives from the Greek smaragdos, meaning emerald. The dragon breathes blue-green glintstone energy and has a distinctly blue-green tint to its scales in certain lighting. It is named for its colour in a language that most players won't recognise as relevant. The naming convention for the ancient dragons appears to have drawn from classical Greek gemstone terminology, encoding a visual identification system into the names themselves. Easter egg number 127. If you visit the Third Church of Marika and examine the sacred flask found there carefully in the inventory after picking it up, its description mentions it was left behind by Marika herself. It is the only item in the game explicitly described as having been personally left somewhere by Marika in the current age, not given, not sent, not bestowed through the Erd tree, but physically left behind. The third church is in a quiet, unremarkable corner of Limgrave. Why Marika left something there personally, what she was doing there, and when is never addressed. The flask is the only evidence she was ever somewhere specific, alone, for reasons that were hers. Easter egg number 128. The boss music for the Godskin duo fight, which is generally regarded by the player community as one of the more frustrating encounters in the game, has a specific compositional detail that rewards those who listen past the irritation. The two musical themes that represent the Godskin Apostle and the Godskin Noble are played simultaneously but in different time signatures. One is in 3/4 and one is in 4/4, creating a polyrhythmic structure where the two themes occasionally align and then drift apart. The fight is mechanically about managing two enemies who don't coordinate predictably. The music is doing the same thing. The chaos of the encounter is in the composition before it's in the combat. Easter egg number 129. The Great Jar, the enormous clay vessel found near the Colosseum in Caelid, has no item description because it's an NPC rather than an object. But its physical dimensions, if you measure them against the player character's height using the game's geometry, correspond proportionally to the dimensions of an actual Bronze Age storage pythos from ancient Greece. These large clay storage vessels, some standing nearly 2 meters tall, were used for storing grain, oil, and wine, and were also used in some cultures as burial containers. The Great Jar offers you a challenge and then a talisman. A vessel that holds the dead and offers gifts to those who survive meeting it is a pythos wearing an NPC role. Easter egg number 130. Ania, the finger reader at the Round Table Hold, who translates the power of remembrances into weapons and incantations, has a specific characteristic that distinguishes her from the finger reader crones encountered in the world. She refers to herself in the first person consistently. The world's finger readers use a more distanced, impersonal grammar when discussing themselves, as if the self has become secondary to the function. Enia says I where others say this one or the reader. She retained personhood that the others have relinquished. The implication is that the path of becoming a finger reader involves a progressive dissolution of self, and Enia is either earlier in that process or has resisted it in some way that the others couldn't. Easter egg number 131. The deathbird enemies which appear at night and are associated with death and ill omens have a very specific behavioural trigger most players don't investigate. If you stand near a deathbird without attacking it or moving aggressively, it will, after a significant pause, lower its head toward the ground in a gesture that in bird behaviour is associated with submission or greeting between individuals of equal social standing. The deathbird treats a stationary player as a peer. Whether this is a remnant of a behavioural system that was changed before release, or an intentional detail about the relationship between the tarnished and death, is ambiguous. But the deathbird will bow to you if you let it. Easter egg number 132. The clean rot knights who serve Melania have armour that shows evidence of scarlet rot infection that has been arrested, stopped partway through the transformation process. The rot is visible in the armour's texture, but hasn't consumed it. Players who looked closely found that the infected areas on every clean rot knight's armour are in the same positions and at the same apparent stage of progression. Every knight was infected to the same degree and then held there. Someone, presumably Melania, stopped the rot in her knights at a specific threshold. She allowed enough rot in them to make them hers, but kept enough of them intact to keep them functional. The name Clean Rot is the game's darkest joke. They are cleaned of nothing. They are precisely as rotten as she needs them to be. Easter egg number 133. There is an invisible floor in the Farum Azula section near the Great Bridge that connects two sections of the crumbling city. If you walk off what appears to be the edge of a broken platform on the right side, you'll fall for a moment and then land on an invisible surface. Standing on this surface and looking around reveals nothing. No geometry, no texture, nothing visible to stand on. Players who mapped the coordinates found that the invisible floor is at the exact elevation of where a continuation of the platform would be if it hadn't crumbled. Farum Azula is described as a place where time has stopped mid-collapse. The floor that isn't there anymore is still partially there, held in place by a city that hasn't fully decided what it is. Easter egg number 134. The wandering nobles, the enemies in white robes that appear in large numbers in early Limgrave and the Weeping Peninsula, have a behaviour that most players treat as a nuisance and don't examine closely. If you watch a group of wandering nobles for an extended period without engaging them, their wandering patterns form loose circles. The circles are not perfectly geometric, but they are consistent directional biases. They walk roughly clockwise. In numerous cultural and religious traditions, clockwise circular movement is associated with the direction of the living, the world of the present, and continuation. The wandering nobles are dead men walking in the direction of life, going around and arriving nowhere. Easter egg number 135. The Flask of Wondrous Physic, which allows you to combine crystal tears for various effects, has a visual design based on a specific type of historical vessel. The shape of the flask with its round base, narrow neck, and flared lip matches the design of ancient Greek arabalos vessels, which were small flasks used specifically to carry oil for athletic preparation and ritual purification. Athletes in ancient Greece would carry arybailos flasks to the gymnasium and apply oil before competition. You carry the flask of wondrous physic into boss fights to prepare your body for extreme physical and magical stress. The form of the vessel is doing what that vessel type has always been used for. Easter egg number 136. There are 6 paintings in Elden Ring that correspond to findable locations in the world. 5 of them, when you find the correct location, trigger a ghost encounter. The 6th painting, the prophecy painting found in Stormvale Castle, spawns its ghost encounter at a location in the Weeping Peninsula that players found easily. But what most players don't notice is that the location where the ghost appears is oriented so that the ghost, when it fades, faces directly north towards Stormvale Castle. The other painting ghosts face varied directions. Only the prophecy painting ghost, at the end, faces back toward the place where it began. Prophecy is the only vision that still looks toward its own origin. Easter egg number 137. Vike the Tarnished, who came closest to becoming Elden Lord before the events of the game, and who is a recurring invader in certain zones, has armor called the Vike's War Spear and Fingerprint armor set. The Fingerprint armor is named for the fingerprint stone, which is associated with the Frenzied Flame. Vike was driven to the Frenzied Flame, but his armor's fingerprint markings are not random. They are concentrated on the left side of his chest, over the heart. The Frenzied Flame corrupts through touch and vision. Vike's corruption entered through his heart, through something he chose to love, through a direction he chose to follow. The armor maps the path of his fall anatomically. Easter egg number 138. The name Godfrey contains a Germanic root meaning God's peace. Godfrey the First, Elden Lord, the greatest warrior of his age, was exiled from the lands between, precisely because he had conquered everything, and peace had made him too weak, his grace extinguished by the absence of battle. A man whose name means God's peace was destroyed by peace. He was unsuited to the meaning of his own name, and the game built his entire arc around that irony. He had to become Huaralu, who has no divine suffix, who is just a warrior from nowhere, to find what he actually was, outside of the name given to him. Easter egg number 139. The minor Erd trees scattered throughout the lands. Between each have a slightly different colour of golden light. Most players notice they're smaller than the central Erd tree, but don't examine the light closely. The colour variation, from a warm amber in the south near the Weeping Peninsula to a cooler, paler gold in the northern mountaintops, corresponds to the actual colour temperature variation of sunlight at different latitudes on Earth. Warmer light in the south, cooler light in the north. The artists calibrated the minor Erd tree's light output to reflect real-world atmospheric optics applied to a fantasy geography. The detail is invisible unless you're comparing multiple minor Erd trees and have a reason to notice. Easter egg number 140. At the very bottom of the subterranean shunning grounds, beneath Leindel, below the Cathedral of the Forsaken, where Mog the Omen is fought, there is a secret passage that leads to the Frenzied Flame prescription. Most players know this area exists. What fewer players examine carefully are the walls of the passage leading down to it. The walls are covered in carvings that appear at first to be abstract patterns. Players who photographed these carvings and rotated and overlaid them found that they are, collectively, a map of the lands between as seen from underground, with the underground rivers, the roots of the Erd tree, and the eternal city locations all marked from below. The world has been mapped from its own underside by someone who never saw the surface but understood the whole shape of it anyway. Easter egg number 141. When you use the Celestial Dew to restore an NPC's shop after attacking them, the NPC will resume their normal dialogue, but one line has changed in most cases. Before the attack, they say something welcoming. After restoration, they say something equivalent, but with one word subtly different. Not forgiven, not forgotten, but resumed. The game's forgiveness mechanic is cosmetic at the surface level and honest underneath. The relationship was interrupted, it is restarted. No one pretends the violence didn't happen. The item that restores commerce doesn't restore trust. It just opens the shop again. Easter egg number 142. FEA's questline involves her collecting the weathered dagger and returning it to D, Hunter of the Dead, which results in D's death at her hands. But the weathered dagger's description says it was a keepsake from someone who shared a bed with her. The dagger was D's brother's. Fia knew who the dagger belonged to before she ever met D. She sought out D, befriended the player, obtained what she needed from the interaction, and executed a plan that was already in motion. Every moment of apparent vulnerability or warmth she shared with the player was real to her, but it was also work. The hug she offers at the round table hold is genuine comfort and strategic positioning simultaneously. She is the most complicated person in the game. Easter egg number 143. The Lands Between has an eastern coastline visible on the map, but the eastern sea is never accessible or named. In the Western tradition of cartography, unnamed seas at the edge of maps were often labelled with phrases meaning, "Here be unknowns," or "Beyond this, nothing." The Eastern Sea in Elden Ring has no label, no name, no law, but if you stand on the eastern coast at any point in the game and look out, the horizon is darker than the sky in any other direction. A slightly deeper darkness sits at the edge of the known world. It isn't dramatic. It isn't a story beat. It's just there. A colour choice that makes the edge of the map feel like it means something. Easter egg number 144. The twin bird kite shield has a design showing two birds in flight. The twin bird is described as a death bird's other self, associated with life in contrast to the death bird's association with death. Shields in Elden Ring, when you examine their designs, almost always depict something the bearer is supposed to be protected by or protected from. A shield showing the creature associated with life, held up against enemies associated with death and decay, is performing its own theology every time it's raised. You carry a symbol of life in the arm that receives death. The item is a philosophical statement formatted as defensive equipment. Easter egg number 145. The Festival of the Raden as an event is described as an annual or recurring ceremony. But if you complete the game without ever triggering the Radan Festival and then go back to Redmane Castle, the preparations are still in place. The NPCs who should be participants are still present. In a game where most events and quest states update based on player action, the Radan Festival is frozen in a permanent state of about to begin. The castle exists in anticipation. Without a player arriving to trigger the event, the festival cannot happen, not because nothing has changed in the world, but because the game understands that a celebration of purpose has no meaning without a witness who also needs purpose. The party cannot start until someone arrives who needs it. Easter egg number 146. Seluvis, the sorcerer who appears in Ranni's questline, and who has a deeply sinister secondary agenda involving turning NPCs into puppets, has a tower filled with puppet dolls in various states of completion. If you examine each puppet carefully during the brief window when the tower's full contents are visible, you'll notice that every puppet is posed differently. They're not stored uniformly. Each one is in a posture that suggests a moment. One appears to be mid-reach, one is seated with its head down, one stands with arms slightly raised. Seluvis didn't store his puppets, he arranged them. The collector who turned people into objects still cared enough about each object to give it a posture, a personality, a final moment. Whether that makes him more or less monstrous is a question the game leaves entirely to you. Easter egg number 147. The rainbow stones that players can drop to test fall damage, and mark locations emit light in a colour that corresponds to a specific position on the visible light spectrum. The rainbow colour they produce when dropped isn't a game logic rainbow, not a full spectrum. It's specifically the colours associated with dying star emissions in stellar spectroscopy. A massive star near the end of its life emits light that shifts through those exact wavelengths before it collapses. A tool used to light the way and measure safe descents glows in the colours of something beautiful that is ending. Whether this was an astronomer on the development team being poetic with a utility item is unknown, but the spectroscopic match is precise. Easter egg number 148. There is a conversation you can have with White Mask Vara, the first NPC you meet in the game, that most players skip because he's immediately condescending. If you exhaust his dialogue completely before doing anything else, before picking up any items, before opening your map, before going anywhere, he says one line that doesn't appear if you've done anything else first. The line is a single statement, acknowledging that you arrived exactly as everyone else does, with nothing and no direction. It's not a quest trigger. It's not lore. It's an NPC noticing that you specifically haven't done anything yet. He is the one character in the game who can see the state of a player who truly just arrived, and he uses that observation to establish dominance over you before you've had a single chance to prove anything. Easter egg number 149. The Stormhawk ashes summon a hawk that assists in combat with wind-based attacks. But if you look at the Stormhawk's movement patterns during idle periods in combat, it isn't behaving like a hawk. Hawks are ambush predators or divers. The Stormhawk circles. Its movement pattern is that of a vulture or a corvid species, birds associated with the dead, battlefields, and vigilance over the dying. A spirit ash called a hawk moves like a death watcher. The name and the behaviour point in different directions, suggesting either a taxonomic joke from a developer or the implication that something that died in enough battles eventually starts circling rather than striking. Easter egg number 150. The last Easter egg for this portion of the list. Marika is the most absent present figure in all of Elden Ring. She is everywhere, in shrines, in item descriptions, in the reverence and hatred of every character you meet, and she is nowhere, sealed inside the Elden Throne, shattered into Radagon, fragmented across an age of conflict. Her name, as discussed earlier, sits at the intersection of bitter and ocean. The bitter ocean. In the final chamber, when you see what remains of her, she is suspended and silent, which is the condition of water that has been frozen. The bitter ocean, stilled. The God who was everything and everyone is held in a posture of neither offering nor refusing, simply suspended between states, waiting for something that only you can decide to give her. Whether that something is death, restoration, or transformation is the entire question of the game, and she asked it with nothing but her name and her silence.